The collective had been watching humanity for 3 centuries before they decided we were a mistake that needed correction. I was there when Ambassador Kelthvar made the announcement. The entire diplomatic corps of 17 species had gathered in the great crystalline hall of Proxima Station, floating in the void between our territories. I remember the way the light refracted through the walls, casting rainbow shadows across the assembled delegates as Kelthvar's translation device converted his chittering clicks into flat, emotionless standard speech. "The human experiment has failed," he said, his compound eyes reflecting no warmth, no hesitation. "Your species represents a fundamental incompatibility with peaceful coexistence. The collective has voted. Humanity will be quarantined indefinitely to your home system. Any vessel attempting to leave Sol will be neutralized." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Ambassador Chen's face remain perfectly still, a mask of diplomatic composure, even as I knew her mind must be racing. The other human delegates showed similar restraint, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands gripped the edges of their seats. "On what grounds?" Chen asked finally, her voice level. Kelthvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been contempt. "Your species has been involved in 73% of all interstellar conflicts since achieving faster-than-light capability. You have refused 16 separate initiatives for genetic behavioral modification. You maintain standing military forces that dwarf those of any 3 collective members combined. You are, by every measurable standard, the most dangerous species to achieve spaceflight in recorded history. We've never started a war." Chen replied quietly. "No," Kelthvar agreed. "You merely finish them with overwhelming, disproportionate force. The collective remembers the Krev massacre. We remember the burning of Felth. We remember what you did to the Sithrak pirate clans. They attacked civilian colonies, and you responded by hunting their species to the edge of extinction. Proportionality is a concept your kind refuses to understand." Kelthvar's voice remained flat, but something in his posture suggested finality. "The quarantine begins in 30 days. We suggest you recall your citizens. Those who refuse to return will be processed accordingly." I watched Chen stand, drawing herself to her full height. She was small compared to most species represented in that hall, but something in her bearing made her seem larger. "The collective is making a mistake." "The collective," Kelthvar replied, "is preventing one." The weapon appeared 3 weeks later. It materialized at the heliopause of the Sol system, precisely at the boundary where human territory met the greater galaxy. The construction had been happening for months, we later learned, in a pocket of warped space-time that kept it hidden from our sensors. When they dropped the veil, it was simply there, as if it had always existed. I was on Earth when the first images came through. The screens in the Unified Defense Command Center lit up with the impossible geometry of the thing. It defied easy description, part station, part weapon, part something we had no words for. Exotic matter twisted space around it, creating a barrier that our best physicists said shouldn't be possible to maintain. "It's a cage," Admiral Kowalski said, staring at the rotating 3-dimensional projection. "They've literally built a cage around our entire solar system." The technical briefing came an hour later. The weapon generated a field that extended inward, creating a bubble of heavily warped space-time. Any ship attempting to cross it would be subjected to relativistic effects so extreme that a journey of a few billion kilometers would take subjective centuries. But it was more than just a barrier. The field also prevented faster-than-light travel, quantum communication, and even certain types of electromagnetic radiation. Sol was being cut off from the universe, wrapped in a cocoon of twisted physics. How long until we're completely isolated? President Williams asked. 72 hours, one of the scientists replied. After that, we're on our own. No FTL, no Ansible, no connection to the Galactic network. From the outside, it'll appear that we've simply stopped, frozen in time. I watched the officials in that room process the information. Some looked angry, others afraid. But most, I noticed, looked thoughtful, almost calculating. What are our options? Williams asked. Admiral Kowalski pulled up a series of projections. We've been running simulations since the announcement. A conventional military assault on the weapon itself is unlikely to succeed. The collective has positioned defensive platforms throughout the outer system. We'd take heavy casualties before we even reached effective range. What about unconventional approaches? The Admiral smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. That's where things get interesting, Madam President. We've had a team working on something, a contingency plan, if you will. The collective thinks they know what we're capable of. They're wrong. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the ambassador, walked me through the lab 3 days before the barrier was set to fully activate. She was young for a lead researcher, barely 40, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The collective made a fundamental miscalculation, she explained, leading me past rows of equipment I couldn't begin to understand. They assumed that because we're aggressive, we're stupid. They assumed that because we fight, we don't think. And we do think? We think constantly about fighting, she said with a grim smile. It's what we're good at. But more importantly, we think about how things work, how systems operate, how to exploit weaknesses. She stopped in front of a massive cylindrical chamber, inside which floated what looked like a miniature sun. They gave us their weapon. They showed us exactly how it works. And in doing so, they gave us the greatest gift they possibly could. I don't understand. The barrier operates on principles of extreme space-time manipulation. It creates a gradient of relativistic effects that intensifies the closer you get to the boundary. But here's the thing, any system that can warp space-time to that degree requires enormous amounts of energy. And that energy has to come from somewhere. I stared at the miniature sun floating in the chamber. They're using a quantum singularity. Several of them, Sarah confirmed. Tiny artificial black holes suspended in exotic matter matrices, outputting energy by way of Hawking radiation. It's elegant, really, self-sustaining, nearly impossible to disrupt from the outside. She paused, her smile widening. But we're not on the outside anymore, are we? The implications started to dawn on me. You want to attack it from inside the barrier. Better, Sarah said. We want to turn it into a weapon, their weapon, and use it to do exactly what they feared we would do. The project was called Heimdall, after the Norse god who guarded the Rainbow Bridge. But as I learned more about it over the following weeks, I thought the name was far too benign for what was being planned. The core concept was almost beautiful in its simplicity. The collective's barrier worked by creating a stable gradient of warped spacetime. But stability in such systems was fragile, maintained by careful balancing of competing forces. If you could introduce the right kind of instability, the right kind of resonant feedback, the entire system could be induced to cascade. Think of it like an avalanche, one of the engineers explained to me. You've got all this potential energy stored in the snow on a mountainside. It's stable until it's not. One right disturbance, and the whole thing comes down. Humanity had been building particle accelerators for centuries. We'd been smashing atoms together, studying quantum phenomena, pushing the boundaries of physics since the early atomic age. The collective knew this, of course. They'd reviewed our technology, deemed it primitive compared to their own capabilities. They'd never considered what we could do with their technology combined with ours. The device they built was massive, a ring structure that would make the old Large Hadron Collider look like a child's toy. It circled the orbit of Mars, utilizing the planet's orbital path as a foundation for its structure. Thousands of installations, each one a node in a massive network, all connected by quantum-entangled communication systems that wouldn't be affected by the barrier. We're building the largest particle accelerator in human history, Admiral Kowalski told me during a tour of one of the construction sites. But we're not accelerating particles. We're accelerating space-time itself. The collective didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Human ships moved frantically throughout the inner system, building, connecting, testing. From the outside, it must have looked like panic. Desperate activity from a species coming to terms with its imprisonment. In reality, it was the most coordinated scientific and military effort in human history. I interviewed dozens of people involved in the project. Engineers who'd solved problems that shouldn't have been solvable. Scientists who'd made intuitive leaps that bordered on miraculous. Military planners who'd coordinated logistics on a system-wide scale with precision that machines would envy. But what struck me most was the anger. Not rage, not fury, but a cold, calculated anger that ran through every person I spoke with. They called us dangerous, one engineer told me, her hands steady as she calibrated equipment that could tear holes in reality. They said we were too violent to be trusted. And maybe they're right. But you don't cage a predator and expect it to become docile. You just teach it to hate cages. The barrier fully activated on schedule. I felt it happen, though I couldn't have said how. A subtle shift in the universe, like a door closing somewhere far away. All across Earth, people stopped and looked up at stars that suddenly seemed farther away than they had any right to be. Communication from the collective ceased. We were alone. Heimdall activated 3 hours later. I was back in the command center, watching on screens as the massive ring around Mars began to pulse with light. Energy readings spiked to levels that made the scientists monitoring them gasp. Space-time itself began to ripple, like a stone dropped in still water. The resonance is building, Sarah Chen reported, her voice tight with tension. We're approaching critical threshold. What happens at critical? President Williams asked. Sarah didn't look away from her screens. We find out if the math works. The math, as it turned out, was perfect. The collective's barrier had been designed to contain humanity, to create a one-way prison that nothing could escape. But the designers had made one critical assumption, that any force applied to the barrier would come from inside, pushing outward, and would therefore be subject to the relativistic effects that made the barrier impenetrable. Heimdall didn't push. It pulled. The accelerator created localized distortions in space-time, tiny imperfections in the fabric of reality itself. These distortions resonated with the barrier's field, creating feedback loops that amplified exponentially. Instead of trying to breach the wall, humanity had found a way to make the wall eat itself. "Cascade is propagating," someone called out. "Field coherence is dropping." On the screens, I watched as the impossible geometry of the collective's weapon began to twist. The stable gradients started to fluctuate wildly. And then, like a dam breaking, the entire system began to collapse. But it didn't just collapse. The energy that had been maintaining the barrier energy from quantum singularities, from twisted dimensions, from sources that made nuclear fusion look like a candle, had to go somewhere. And humanity, in its careful calculations, had determined exactly where it should go. Outward. The collective's defensive platforms were the first to die. They'd been positioned throughout the outer system, ready to engage any human ships that might have tried to escape. When the barrier collapsed, the wave of exotic energy that propagated outward hit them like the fist of an angry god. Ships simply ceased to exist, their matter converted to energy in microseconds. Installations built to withstand planetary impacts were torn apart at the molecular level. The defensive net that was supposed to keep humanity contained became kindling in a firestorm of our own making. But the energy didn't stop at the heliopause. The wave continued outward, carrying with it the warped space-time that had formed the barrier. It moved at superluminal speeds, violating causality in ways that would give physicists nightmares for generations. The collective staging areas in nearby systems vanished. Supply depots, communication relays, military installations, anything within 20 light-years of Sol was caught in the expanding sphere of destruction. We'd turned their weapon into the largest explosive device ever created and aimed it directly at them. I watched the reports come in over the following days as our quantum communication systems, no longer blocked by the barrier, reconnected with the galactic network. The devastation was staggering. The collective had lost nearly 40% of its military infrastructure in the first hour. Species that had considered themselves safe, insulated from human aggression by distance and treaties, suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a war they'd voted for but never expected to see. The diplomatic messages started arriving within hours. Pleas for ceasefire, demands for explanation, threats of retaliation. Ambassador Chen fielded them with the same composure she'd shown in that crystalline hall months earlier. "We are not interested in war," she told the collective's emergency council. "We never were. But you made a choice to imprison us, to treat us as criminals for the crime of being effective at defending ourselves. You built a weapon to stop us. We merely turned it into what you feared most proof that your fear was justified." Kelthvar himself appeared on the communication link, his compound eyes somehow conveying emotions his species wasn't supposed to have. You've killed billions, destroyed hundreds of worlds. For what? To prove a point? No, Shen replied coldly. To ensure you never make the mistake of caging us again. You wanted to quarantine humanity because we were dangerous. Now, you have evidence of exactly how dangerous we are when threatened. I suggest the collective factor that intuits future decisions. The aftermath was complicated. The collective didn't collapse, but it was fundamentally changed. Species that had voted for humanity's quarantine suddenly found themselves reconsidering their position. Some demanded justice, trials for war crimes. Others argued for immediate peace negotiations. A few even proposed formal alliances, recognizing that having humanity as an ally was preferable to having them as an enemy. I spent months traveling, interviewing survivors and witnesses, trying to understand what had happened. In the Threxian colonies, I met beings who'd lost their homeworld to the energy wave. Their anger was palpable, but so was their bewilderment. We thought we were safe, one Threxian elder told me, her crystalline skin dimmed with grief. The collective promised us that humanity would be contained. Instead, you reached out and touched us from halfway across the galaxy. How do we defend against that? You don't, I said quietly. That's the point. On Kelthvar's homeworld, I was granted a rare interview with the former ambassador. He'd been removed from his position, disgraced by the catastrophic failure of the quarantine plan. He received me in his private habitat, a far cry from the grand halls of diplomatic power. We were wrong, he admitted, his translation device somehow conveying shame. Not about humanity being dangerous. About that, we were entirely correct. But we were wrong to think we could contain you. Wrong to think that caging a predator would make the galaxy safer. What will the collective do now? I asked. Learn, he said simply. Learn to coexist with a species that will not be controlled. Learn to work with humanity rather than against it. Or, he paused, his mandibles clicking softly, or wait for you to destroy yourselves. Some in the collective believe that is inevitable. And you? I no longer know what to believe. You built a weapon that should not exist using our own technology against us. You killed billions without hesitation when threatened. But you also stopped. When you could have pressed your advantage, when you could have shattered the collective entirely, you chose restraint. I do not understand your species, Ambassador. I doubt I ever will. Back on Earth, I attended the memorial service for the human casualties of the crisis. The number was surprisingly small, a few thousand who'd been caught in the initial effects of Heimdall's activation, engineers and scientists who'd known the risks but proceeded anyway. President Williams gave the eulogy. These people died, she said, so that humanity could remain free. They understood that freedom has a price, and they paid it willingly. The galaxy calls us dangerous. They call us violent. They call us a threat to peace. And perhaps they're right. But we are also free. We are uncontained. We are unbowed. And we will remain so. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence, during which I looked up at the stars. They seemed closer now than they had in weeks, as if the universe had welcomed us back. Or perhaps It was simply that we'd reminded the universe of our presence. I thought about everything I'd witnessed, everything I'd learned. The collective had built a weapon to stop humanity, thinking they could solve the problem of our existence through isolation and control. They'd failed to understand the fundamental truth about our species. We don't just adapt to adversity. We weaponize it. 3 years have passed since the Heimdall event, as it's now known. The galaxy has settled into an uneasy peace, one where humanity is no longer seen as a problem to be solved, but as a fact to be accommodated. The collective still exists, but it's changed. More cautious, more aware of its limitations. Ambassador Chen now heads the Human Diplomatic Corps, the youngest person ever to hold the position. Under her leadership, humanity has negotiated treaties with 24 species, opened trade routes that were previously closed to us, and established research partnerships that have advanced both human and alien science. But we've also kept building. New ships, new weapons, new technologies. The collective watches nervously, but says nothing. They've learned their lesson. Dr. Sarah Chen received the Global Science Award for her work on Heimdall. In her acceptance speech, she said something that's been quoted endlessly across both human and alien media. They tried to cage us with physics. We responded by teaching physics to obey us instead. That, more than anything, is what it means to be human. I've written dozens of articles about the crisis, trying to make sense of it all. But I keep coming back to that moment in the command center, watching the barrier collapse and the energy wave propagate outward. In that moment, humanity had become exactly what the collective feared, a species capable of weaponizing anything, including the very forces meant to constrain us. Were we right to do what we did? The philosophers and ethicists will debate that question for centuries. Billions died. Worlds were destroyed. The galaxy was forever changed by our response to what we saw as existential threat. But we're still here, still free, still human. And the next time someone tries to build a cage around us, they'll remember what happened to the last one. They'll remember that humanity doesn't just escape traps, we turn them into weapons. We turn them into doom. Not because we're evil or because we enjoy destruction, but because we refuse to be anything other than what we are. A species that looks at impossible challenges and asks not, how do we survive this? But how do we win? The collective built a weapon to stop us. We turned it into the very thing they feared most. That's not a bug in human nature. It's a feature. And the galaxy has finally learned to respect it.